Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Student's History of Harvard College with Dr. Zachary Nowak. Now, as we get underway, and so many of you are logging on, I just have a couple of housekeeping notes I'd love to mention. Feel free to use the chat box to say hello from wherever you are in the world, and use the Q&A box for any questions that you wish to ask Zach during tonight's recorded presentation. We will leave ample time after his presentation to address as many of your questions as possible. Now, my name is Jill Felicio, and I am a member of Harvard Extension School's classes of 2000 and 2013, as well as the Director of Advancement for the Division of Continuing Education. And I'm delighted to welcome you tonight for a fascinating look at the historical origins of our beloved Harvard. Now, in my role at Harvard, I am privileged to work with the Harvard Extension Alumni Association's Board of Directors and hundreds of dedicated volunteer leaders from around the world to create lifelong benefits and opportunities for our incredible community. In fact, tonight's event was co-sponsored by the Harvard Extension Alumni Association's Texas chapter, the Harvard Club of Dallas, and the Harvard Club of Austin. Thank you all for this wonderful idea and for all that you do for the Harvard community. Now, I'd like to invite Ariel Gamino to say a few words about this artful collaboration. Ariel?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jill. On behalf of the Harvard Extension Alumni Association of Texas chapter, I first want to thank Jill, Veronica, Chrissy, and everyone from the Office of Advancement for supporting us through the pandemic and for making an event like this possible. I also want to thank Professor Nowak for talking about such an interesting topic. Listening to the echoes from the past through the eyes of a historian, what a wonderful treat. I also want to thank the Texas chapter, the Harvard Club of Austin, the Harvard Club of Dallas for making our own history today. And this is the first of, I hope, many, many events that go across multiple clubs and multiple alumni associations, truly under the one Harvard umbrella. And for all of you guys watching, I encourage you to participate in your regional chapter and your clubs. We're here to connect with you, to celebrate your successes, and to serve you. So please do reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Ariel. Now, as we move through, I'd also love to invite Shidu Salar from the Harvard Club of Dallas. If he would like to pop on and say hello, I'd love that.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Jill. My name is Chidu Sulur. I'm the president of Harvard Club of Dallas and an extension school alum, class of 2011. It's my honor and pleasure to be part of this event. I would like to thank Dr. Nowak for sharing the evening with us, and also want to thank HEAA and the Texas chapter for arranging this wonderful event. So for those in the Dallas and North Texas area, so we encourage you to connect with that club. Harvard Club of Dallas has over 550 registered dues-paying members. There are several programs, philanthropic activities, so look forward to connecting with many of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Chidu. And last but not least, Glenn Cooley. Welcome, and please introduce yourself. Just need to unmute, Glenn. Just boop. There we go.
Am I there? Hi, everybody. It's Glenn Cooley, Harvard, Secretary of the Harvard Club of Austin. And thank you, Jill, for the introduction. Ariel, everyone, it's good to see you. Well, sort of see you. We're looking forward to this. Really want to thank everyone for participating and viewing today. Jill, you and your staff for all the logistics and putting this together. And for everyone else, if you're interested in the Harvard Club of Austin, reach out to any of the officers or anyone within the club, and we can get you hooked up because we have a lot of exciting things happening in the near future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you all, our Harvard Club volunteers and Harvard Extension School alumni extraordinaires, for the work that you are doing out building our community in Texas, just one of our just most esteemed and wonderful colleagues in Texas. Miss you all. Can't wait to see you in person. But really now, I'd like to, without further ado, please introduce our wonderful faculty presenter for the evening. Dr. Zachary Nowak is a lecturer on history at Harvard, where his research and teaching centers on the history of the built and natural environment in the United States and the world. His current book project, The State in the Station, the 19th Century American Train Station and State Power, offers a social history of one of the most important places in the 19th century American city, the main train station. Dr. Nowak is also the advisory board chair of the Center of Food and Sustainability Studies at the Umbria Institute in Italy. Dr. Nowak received his PhD from Harvard in 2018 and holds masters from both Harvard and Middlebury College, and received his BA from Kenyon College. So without further ado, let's give Dr. Zachary Nowak a very warm welcome.
Thanks so much for that, Jill. I really appreciate it. I'm going to toggle over to the other screen here and start my share. Okay. Before anything else, I want to say thanks to all these people who I've been in contact with, who have set this up, and again to thank Harvard Extension, Alumni Association, the Texas chapter, the Harvard clubs of both Austin and Dallas, and DCE's Office of Special Events. Thanks also to everybody who tuned in on a Tuesday night. We have Harvard alums from a bunch of different schools, current degree candidates, course takers, and a ton of other people. So thanks for tuning in. The first thing I want you to do is this. I want you to picture the typical Harvard student in 1880. My guess is that these are probably the guys that you're picturing. And these were definitely important people at Harvard, and very self-important people as well. I taught a course on Harvard history in the fall of 2019 in Harvard College, and I was so dissatisfied with the existing general histories of Harvard that I decided to write my own history of the college. And tonight, I'm going to give you some anecdotes that I discovered during the research, and read a couple of the short passages from the book manuscript. Also, Teddy Roosevelt is in the front row, second from the right, just FYI. I am definitely not the first person to write a book about Harvard. There are literally scores of books on Harvard, on all different aspects, on religion at Harvard, on architecture at Harvard. One of the best general histories, or one of the best known general histories, is by one of my predecessors in the history department, the historian Samuel Eliot Morison. But this history ends in 1936. And so, as we all know, there's a lot more history after 1936. I am also not the first professor who's ever taught a class on the history of Harvard. Reverend Peter Gomes taught a class for many years called Religion 1513, History of Harvard and its Presidents. And Gomes drew extensively on this Morison book, and some of you on this call maybe even have taken this class. And if you didn't, you can probably tell from Reverend Gomes' title for his class what the focus was: Harvard's Presidents. This is mainly an institutional history. It was a religious history, and the students, the actual students, were really minor characters. People like staff were shadowy figures at the edge of the stage with no lines. And my training is different. As Jill said before, I'm mainly a 19th century US historian, and my mother is always scandalized that I can't name the presidents between Rutherford B. Hayes and Roosevelt. And frankly, I'm just not that interested in political history. And I know that is important history. It's just not interesting to me personally. And so I'm also not terribly interested in Harvard's illustrious presidents. So in my drama, in my new book, and tonight, Harvard's presidents are the characters at the edges of the stage with very few lines. And my class and my book are focused on the students. What was it like to be a student at Harvard in 1676 or in 1735 or 1835 or 1920? But there are also many other people in my dramatis personae. There's lots of other people that are actors in my drama. These are some waiters at Memorial Hall in the 1880s. I didn't set out to write a revisionist history of Harvard. But what I found in my research in the Harvard archives is that there were a lot of other people at Harvard who made it what it was and what it is today. And they might not always have been students, but they've always been part of this institution. There have been women at Harvard since 1636, some of whom, working as data entry clerks at the observatory in the late 1800s, quite literally invented modern astronomy. And I won't talk about that tonight, but it's a great story. Others, like these Radcliffe students, challenged gender roles and fought for coeducation. This is Caleb Cheesetimik. He is Harvard's first native graduate, class of 1665. And Caleb Cheesetimik was a first-generation student. No matter what you look like or who you are, there have always been people at Harvard like you. That is the basic argument of the class, that there are a lot more people that have contributed to Harvard than just these elite white dudes who were the students in the 1880s. So this is what I want to do tonight. I'm going to go through these 6 topics. Obviously, this is not going to be an encyclopedic look at Harvard, but I hope it will be an amusing one, and hopefully you learn some stuff that you didn't know before. And remember, the final exam is next Friday at 10 a.m. Just kidding. Okay, admissions, first thing. So I need a translation for this on the fly into English. Crickets. Okay. When, O Catiline, do you mean to cease abusing our patience? How long is that madness of yours still to mock us? When is there to be an end of that unbridled audacity of yours? So if you wanted to go to Harvard in the 1600s, and actually pretty far into the 19th century, this is what you needed. You would show up in Cambridge on the day of the test, and you would be examined by either the president, or maybe a couple of the professors would do some examining, or the tutors, and they would see if you had a basic knowledge of Latin, basic to intermediate, a little bit of Greek, just enough to like read something quick, and then the money for the semester. Those were the only 3 things that you needed to get admitted to Harvard. Harvard, for hundreds of years, was pretty desperate to have students, and so they weren't super picky. If you got in, the document that admitted you was called an admititure. And this is the admititure of Warren Williams from 1715. And notice that it's all in Latin, just like the test. So if you got admitted, you passed the test, you had to copy out all of the rules of Harvard College. And so I'll zoom in a minute, and my Latin is pretty rusty. The statutes, laws, and privileges from the president and fellows of Harvard College that located in Cambridge and New England have approved and sanctioned these laws. Okay. So if you were admitted, you would write out these in longhand Latin. Now, by the 1730s, they ease up a little bit, and so you can write it out in English. This is another admititure, and I'll explain that word in a minute. This is Richard Waldron, and you can see this body of laws for Harvard College was made by the president and fellows thereof and consented to by the overseers of said college. Notice the D here in college. There's not a universal way of spelling the word college, and so it's very flexible. Even in the same document, sometimes students spell it different ways. But in any event, when you were admitted, you would copy out these laws of Harvard College, and on the last page, the president would write admititure, which just means let him be admitted. And here we have the signature Latinized name of John Leverett, who is the president, and then there's Henry Flint, who is the secretary. Okay, so now you're finally in. What do you do? What's college life like? Well, we know a decent amount about college life from the 1730s. First of all, for the records of all the stuff that students got punished for. We know a little bit, but then there's also this neat thing that for a while, students copy out all of the college laws, but then they also copy out this set of rules called college customs. And that's the rules the students themselves have made up. And they're super funny. So this first one, if you can want to try it, I'll give you just a second. Try to read that first one yourself. So that first one says, no freshman shall wear his hat in the college yard except it rains, snows, or hails, or he be on horseback, or hath both hands full. A couple of my other favorites from this list, number 6, if you want to join me, number 6, no freshman shall talk saucily to his senior or speak to him with his hat on. You couldn't talk to a senior if you had your hat on, you had to take it off. Number 9 is sort of interesting for those of you who are interested in the history of college sports. Freshmen are to find the rest of the scholars with bats, balls, and footballs. Is this early baseball, early football? Number 16, some other things freshmen have to do. They had to go to chapel twice a day with the rest of the students, and no freshman shall lean at prayers, but shall stand upright. And then probably my favorite is number 20. And I'm not going to explain this one, but you can just figure it out for yourself. No freshman shall mingo against the college wall, nor go into the fellows' archjon. I'm just going to leave it at that. Rules are great because they show what people in power were nervous about people not in power doing. So I'll let you read this for a second. So no smoking and no drinking, 1655. Luckily, both in the records of the punishments of students, but also in the archive that is Harvard Yard, that is the dirt in Harvard Yard, we can see whether or not students followed this rule. And they didn't. They didn't at all. These are pipes. Harvard Yard has a superabundance of 17th century pipes, which means that students were smoking like fiends all the time. And not only were they smoking, but they weren't using this sort of cheap red pipes made in New England, but they were using these more expensive imported white pipes. So again, Harvard Yard full of these pipes. How about the drinking? How about on that score? No, they weren't following that rule either. Harvard Yard, when their excavations are done, they find all kinds of stuff like this. There's beer tankards, there's wine glasses, and there's also a lot of liquor bottles, glass liquor bottles. Harvard Yard not only had more liquor bottles per square foot than comparable colonial era sites, Harvard Yard had more liquor bottles per square foot than comparable colonial era tavern sites. So even more drinking going on than in tavern sites, which is pretty amazing. How about this? I'll let you read that for a second. Afterwards, I'm going to ask everyone when I'm done to turn on their videos, and I'm going to assess whether any of you have strange, ruffian-like, or newfangled fashions. So these are called sumptuary laws. These are to make sure that students don't dress up too much. They're sort of acknowledging, even with their dress, that they're at the bottom of the hierarchy. And yet, when we poke around in the dirt, we find all sorts of hairpins and these cufflinks. And this was strictly against the rules, but clearly students didn't follow the rules. Okay, one more rule. Did students gamble, or did they follow this rule and not play at dice? Same thing here. They completely ignored that rule and played at dice a lot, judging by the number of little dice that we find in the soil. Okay, dorm rooms. So we don't have any images, actual images of dorm rooms until the very late 1700s. But in 1764, Harvard Hall, which is the building on the left here, burns down. This is the first Harvard Hall, not the one that's there now. The one that's there now replaced this. Also notice that the yard had a little, like a low stone wall around it. On the right in this picture is Massachusetts Hall, and in the center is Stoughton College, not to be confused with Stoughton Hall. This building is actually, along with the other two, was where colonial soldiers were billeted during the Revolutionary War, and the soldiers did so much damage to Stoughton College that it was eventually pulled down. And so it's sort of in front of where University Hall would be. In any event, Harvard Hall on the left had the dining hall called the Commons. It had this other sort of little store called the Buttery, had some classrooms, and then also had student dorm rooms in that very top. If you look at the top of that building, that third floor, you can see some little windows. Those are student rooms. The Massachusetts General Court, the sort of colonial government, was meeting at Harvard because it was the biggest building outside of Boston, and there was a plague epidemic. There was a pandemic, I think cholera or smallpox. So instead of being in Boston, they flee out into the countryside to Cambridge, and they meet in one of the big classrooms. And somehow a fire gets started and burns the whole building down. And the General Court decides to reimburse Harvard for this building and pay for a new building. Harvard at this time also is a public school. Harvard's a public school supported by Massachusetts until the 1820s. In any event, they say to the students, the 6 or 8 students who live in Harvard Hall, they say, look, make up a list of all the stuff that was in your dorm room when this building caught fire and burned down, and we'll reimburse you for it. And so these lists, these reimbursement lists, give us a fascinating look at what students had in their dorm rooms. So now I'm going to read a little bit from the book manuscript. A rough categorization of the objects listed by the students shows some surprising continuities with later dorm rooms. Furniture, clothes, books, things related to drinking and dining, personal hygiene products, and decorations are the main items on the list. The majority of the specifically named things that were lost in the fire were books. Students had Latin and Greek works like Cicero's speeches and Caesar's historical works, as well as English translations of these same books. In addition to school books, there were also almanacs, magazines, and in one case, a singing book. These books were likely arrayed on bookcases. These were also on the list, or in some cases stacked on desks or stored in trunks, for which several students had padlocks. Other furniture included beds, pillows, and blankets. Remember, at this time, there were no common spaces for students to meet and chat, especially outside of the very carefully surveilled dining hall spaces. And this was likely the reason that there were so many chairs. I was fascinated when I'm reading this list. There were so many damn chairs. Several of the students had half a dozen chairs, and one student even had 10 chairs. Most of the students, in addition to their books, had the necessary apparatus for student life. They had ink and ink pots, paper, and a pencil case. One also had a slate, and several had both candles and a candlestick. These were complemented by personal hygiene products like combs and brushes, razors, looking glasses, and several crisping irons for wigs. It's not clear where the students stored their clothes, but they had linen shirts, breeches, jackets, towels, and several kinds of hats. On this list was an old hat, a beaver hat, and a square hat, as well as belt buckles, gowns, handkerchiefs, shoes, and boots. There were also the necessary tools to keep a fire going. Remember, that's how you're keeping your room hot. There was a small shovel for ashes. There were tongs, bellows, and a tinderbox, as well as several hammers, a hatchet, a file, and a whetstone. One category of dorm room objects that may seem familiar to modern students are things for dining and drinking. Though colonial era students ate in the Harvard Commons, the dining hall, they seem to have occasionally improvised cooking in their fireplaces, as there was at least one chafing dish and a toasting iron. In addition to various plates, cups, and silverware, students also listed tea, sugar, 10 pounds in one case and 7 in another, a chocolate cake was under someone's bed. There was a nutmeg and a grater, tobacco and pipes, and you will not be surprised to learn that booze was omnipresent. Students had wine glasses and rum and 3 punch bowls and a small barrel of hard cider. And it's unclear if the last item in this category, 2.5 dozen empty bottles, should actually be the last thing in the dining and drinking category or the first thing in the next category, which is decorations. I sort of see all these empty bottles as maybe being proof of drinking prowess then as today. A number of students had maps or pictures or glassed pictures or woodcuts in their request for reimbursement. It's not clear in the records whether these things were actually hung up on the walls and were meant as decoration, but it seems reasonable to conclude that this was their function. We're gonna have to jet forward to find the first real sketch of a Harvard dorm room. It's in 1850. There's a great satirical sketchbook made in 1850 called College Scenes. It's all online too, if you want to find it later in Hollis. You can see every single page. So this is the first matin bell. So the morning bell reminds the freshman of his toilet. Reminds the freshman he has to get up and get dressed and go to chapel at like 6:30 in the morning. I'm going to ask you to notice both the boxing gloves and the picture of the skull. Grace Hall, one of the first modern dorms, is built in 1863. And Thayer and Weld and Matthew follow quickly thereafter in the 1860s. And near the end of the century, we start getting photographs of dorm rooms. And boy, do they have a lot of stuff in them. So I want you to take a look at this dorm room for a second. And notice what things were on the list from 1764. So you have the tongs there to work with the fire. It looks like there's some books. There's pens and ink in the middle on the desk. Notice the boxing gloves and the fencing, I can't remember, foils. And then also the hat with the skull and crossbones. There's a famous Harvard secret society called the MedFac, medical faculty, and they pull pranks and blow things up, and they last for over 100 years. So some of you may have seen this in the old yard, this pump, and it just sort of sits there and you sort of wonder, why is this pump here? Most upper class Americans were beginning to install central steam heating by the 1870s, and their sons were increasingly dissatisfied with their frigid accommodations on the yard. Not to mention the fact that those dorms I just talked about, Gray's, Weld, they only had basements. They only had toilets in the basement. So no central heating in any of those dorms, and toilets in the basement, no running water. And as late as the 1880s, students living on the old yard had to go outside to this college pump to get a bucket of water, even in the winter. So the result was a mass exodus from the yard for those students at the end of the 19th century who could afford it. Rather than living in one of the small boarding houses around Cambridge, the wealthier students chose Beck Hall. Beck Hall was built in 1876, where the Inn at Harvard now houses swing students, and I'll show you in a second where that is. Single and double suites in Beck Hall had a study, closets, 1 or 2 bedrooms off the study, and a bathroom with hot and cold water, chandeliers, and most importantly, steam heating apparatus. They had central heating. To maintain the gentility that the open flame suggested, the rooms also had a fireplace with white marble mantle as well. And Beck Hall's enormous success led to the construction of what became known as the Gold Coast. And I'll show that in a minute. The Gold Coast in the last decade of the 19th century. So just to show you where Beck Hall is, the Barker, which some of you might know as the Union, is sort of off to the left here. I'm taking this from Grafton Street restaurant, and to the right is Mass Ave and Central Square. So I'll just change that view a little bit. You can sort of see the edge of the Barker's round thing over here. This is the swing housing, and then Mass Ave goes down that way. The Gold Coast. So here's Lamont up here in the upper right, just to let you orient yourself. And the yard is sort of up in here. The Gold Coast was a stretch of Mount Auburn Street between Holyoke Street down here and Bow Street, where, one after another, huge new private dormitories were built to accommodate the wealthier set of students who didn't want to go out to the damn yard and haul water from the pump. Excuse my French. Nostalgia notwithstanding. These were modeled on Beck Hall, but they were built on a grander, much more opulent scale. Their owners wanted to attract people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who arrived in 1900 and rented room B17 in Westmoreland Court, which is a museum to this day. Roosevelt and his Gold Coast classmates enjoyed not only running water, steam heat, and private dining, their dormitories also had these grand staircases, libraries, lounges, and in the case of Westmoreland Court, a heated indoor swimming pool. This Gold Coast of all these private dormitories became one of Harvard's houses, Adams House. Some of you may know it as Adams. Okay, I want to jump forward to classes. Cool. So You are a first semester freshman. So what are you doing at Harvard? Take a look in the upper left-hand corner. This is not the curriculum in the 1600s or the 1700s. This is 1824. 1824, almost 200 years after Harvard is founded, it is still stuck in this antiquated classical curriculum. So most of the curriculum is just Latin and Greek with some STEM subjects. If you notice, seniors, first term seniors are doing astronomy, first term juniors are doing chemistry. There's a little bit of history there for the sophomores, but a lot of it is Latin and Greek, which the students see as mostly pointless. Go figure. There are a whole bunch of revolts in the dining halls between the late 1700s. Henry David Thoreau's grandfather, Asa Dunbar, actually starts one of these. But the biggest ones are in the 1820s. And these revolts are there for a couple different reasons. First of all, Harvard admits students as young as 14 and 15 years old, really, really young kids. They're not admitted despite their age, they're admitted because of their age. There's this idea that young kids need to go and have really strict discipline because their parents would probably spoil them, and especially their mothers. There's a sort of a gender aspect. So you got all these young kids. They have this packed day. They're getting up really early in the morning, chapel, all these really boring subjects. The teaching is awful. And then they have crappy food too. And so they rebel. And the last time they rebel, it forces Harvard to change around its method of instruction. But that doesn't really happen until the end of the 1800s. You get a new president in 1869, President Eliot, who's, I mean, I'm not like super interested in any of the presidents, but Eliot's a pretty decent guy as they come, certainly better than Lowell. And Eliot decides to get rid of this. This was the method of instruction, and actually looks like a decent number of my graduate school classes at Harvard. The idea was that you memorize these long passages in Greek and Latin, and then you had the recitation, and you just stood up and you recited a bunch of it, and the professor either liked it or he didn't. That was how people learned, or I should say that was how people didn't learn at all. This finally Eliot starts to get rid of this system in the 1880s. It takes a long time. But there are other parts of Harvard that are way more progressive. Guess which part? This is the summer school. And this is the extension, DCE it's a number of different things that sort of come together to form what is now extension. But one of them was the summer school. And 150 years ago, in the summer of 1871, this guy, Asa Gray, he's a professor of natural history. He has this crazy idea that he's going to teach in the summer. And he has this new lab in the Harvard Botanical Gardens, which are right up across from the Radcliffe Quad. And he's going to teach women, and also working class people. Isn't that insane? And guess what? The summer school classes are mobbed, and the administrators at Harvard are shocked the first year when there are more women taking the classes than men. Why would women be interested in STEM subjects like geology and chemistry and botany? But this is very consistent. While these summer school classes go, a huge part of them are women. So Harvard College doesn't have coeducation with women until 1942, but the summer school part of extension is way ahead of the college, which I think is cool. Another part of the thread that gets woven, sorry, this says 1871, but that's wrong. Another part of this thread that gets woven in to what becomes extension is this guy, John Lowell Jr. He has an interesting costume on here, but he's one of the Boston Brahmins. He's an elite Bostonian related to the other Lowells. He goes to Harvard at 14, and this is in 1813. He's 14 years old, but he drops out and decides he's going to go travel. He comes back to Boston and he devotes himself to business and politics. But then he has this personal tragedy. In 1831, his wife and his 2 children die in the course of a year. And so he goes off on this huge traveling spree with all this money that the Lowells have. He goes to the Netherlands and Belgium and Italy and Turkey and Armenia and Egypt. And in Egypt, he gets sick. Not really clear what he gets sick with, but he writes a will. He decides to leave a substantial amount of money to endow public lectures in Boston on initially just on religion. But then he broadens it and he says, okay, philosophy, natural history, the arts and sciences. And this is called the Lowell Institute. And it has to be run by one of the Lowell men, a man in the Lowell family. And he also says that the lectures were to be free for those of limited means. And for those who could afford to attend the upper level classes, the maximum charge was to be no more than the value of 2 bushels of wheat. So you will notice on Extension's logo, there are the 2 bushels of wheat. I'm not going to comment on the price of Extension school classes, but I just looked up the current price of wheat as of April 30th, 2021 is $7.36 per bushel. So just throwing that out there. In any event, Lowell's, the Lowell Institute, ultimately, it's one of the Lowell's, President Abbott Lawrence Lowell, who is running this institute and basically steers this into Harvard. And so this is another strand of what will become Extension ultimately. I did a little bit of research on Extension the last couple of weeks, and there are some other really cool stories. So Extension is at the cutting edge of education. In 1949, they decide to offer these Lowell Institute classes on the radio, on this new radio station. And New Englanders could go to college 6 nights a week at 7:30 p.m. in their living rooms. All they had to do was to turn on the radio. They could listen to courses on psych, on world history, and economics. And the radio courses proved to be so successful that when WGBH went on the air, Boston Public TV, in 1951, one of their first programs and one of their most successful programs was an Extension school class every weekday at 3:30 and 7:30. So fast forward 10 years, in 1960, the United States Navy approaches Harvard about adapting these television courses to be broadcast to their Polaris nuclear submarines. And so there's this 2-year program, the Polaris University Extension Program, developed with WGBH and Harvard Extension, and it produced 5 to 6 courses a year in engineering, math, physics, foreign languages, and other electives. And so they would get these classes beamed to them on the sub, and then when they would come into port, they'd have like a lab section. Super cool. Back to the college, I want to talk about easy classes. I want everybody in this call just to think for a minute about the easiest class that they've taken at Harvard, if you're a Harvard student, and what you would call that class. What was that class called? So today, Harvard students call them GEMS. But in the past, they've been known as SNAP courses or CINCH courses, or some people on this call might know them as GUT classes. Remember, GEMS is what Harvard students call them today, and rubies and opals may be difficult to find, but GEMS over the last 150 years have been easy to spot from a distance because of the size of their enrollments and their fame on campus. One of the very first GEMS after the introduction, the change in the curriculum to introduce elective courses in the 1880s, was Professor Nathaniel Shaler's Geology 4. And Shaler said it was all the geology necessary to a gentleman, whatever that means. Definitions of what qualifies as a GEM differ, but the core characteristic is an excellent return on investment. So that means a relatively secure A in return for minimal time in the lecture hall, minimal reading, and minimal paper writing. Innovative and generous Harvard students of today have even created a student-made gem finder. This is online, you can go look at it, which reviews and classifies potential gems in order of their gemminess. But I think the funniest part of the story is that Harvard students, like those everywhere, have long given these big classes, popular classes, informal names. So the Crimson is an excellent resource for this. So here's some of the ones I found, mostly from the 60s. The history of the South was called Mint Juleps. There's another class in the history department called Maritime and Naval History, and that was called Boats. 20th century painting was called Spots and Dots. Human behavioral biology was called Sex. Chemistry 1 was Kitty Chem. The nature of living things became known as Baby Bio. And Natural Science 10, which was on geology, was called either Rocks or Rocks for Jocks. Sports. The first real organized sport at Harvard is the rowing club. And The first intercollegiate sporting event ever happens at Lake Winnipesaukee, New Hampshire. You have this guy from Yale, James Elkins. He's riding on the Boston, Concord, and Montreal train. And he strikes up a conversation with his Yale alum, James Whitten, who was one of the managers of the train. And Whitten said, geez, would it be great if like Yale could row against Harvard? Because at that point, there were just clubs at the schools. They didn't actually go against other schools. And so they decide to have a race. And Whitson says, if you can get the Harvard team up here to row against you, I'll pay all the expenses for a week. And so on August 3rd, 1852, the first intercollegiate sporting event ever took place between Harvard and Yale. The Yale team was dressed in white and red, and the Harvard team was white and blue, as the Harvard Crimson was not yet in vogue. Harvard only had one boat, the original one that they bought, the Oneida, and they won not only the heat, but they won the actual race itself. So the first sporting event ever for American colleges was won by Harvard over Yale. Hooray. Football. Where Memorial Hall now stands was a triangular piece of ground called the Delta. And in the 1820s and 1860s, the classes would play each other in football in the fall. When I say classes, I mean the sophomore against the freshman. And so if you look at the caption here, it says, in the annual football contest, the sophomores kick the freshmen and the freshmen strive to kick the ball. Now we can see here there are no uniforms. There don't seem to be lines on the field. There are no referees, lots of spectators, also lots of players. The annual classes between the 1820s and 1860s went from 40 or 50 students to over 100. So this is a big group. And luckily we have a great diary entry from John Sibley, who says, the ball is thrown down among the players and the object of each class is to kick the other and bark their shins as much as possible. Obviously, the freshmen have a huge disadvantage because they don't really know who's in the freshman class yet. This is right at the beginning of the semester, whereas all the sophomores know each other. This goes on for a while until you get actual organized intercollegiate football. I want you to look at this picture, but specifically at the ball. You can guess from this ball that there is no passing game. And in fact, early on, the game is much like soccer until Harvard plays McGill. Harvard plays McGill in 1874, and McGill has a running game. You can pick up the ball and run with it. And Harvard loves this rule. And so they go back in 1874, and they say to Yale and Princeton, hey, we want to play with these new rules we got from McGill. And Yale and Princeton say, no, we want to play, where you kick the ball, where no one can pick it up. And Harvard says, okay, well, we're not going to play anymore with you guys. We're just going to play with McGill. So Harvard actually compels Yale and Princeton to change how they play football. And Harvard reinvents, or I should say invents, American football for the first time by introducing picking up the ball and running with it. But they actually reinvent American football a second time in the early 1900s. You may not realize it, I certainly didn't, but the very first steel reinforced concrete stadium in the world was Soldiers Field Stadium in 1903, modeled, as you can see, on the stadiums of ancient Rome and Greece, but it's the very first stadium paid for by the alumni, not by the college. But what happens is when you have these running games and hardly any protective equipment, lots of people die. In the first 5 years of the 20th century, 45 college football players died, most of them on the field because they didn't wear protective gear. And the running game was supreme. So this causes a national outcry, and people wanted to ban college football, make it illegal. And this comes to a head in 1905. And Teddy Roosevelt, who I normally can't stand, saves the day. This is the only time I like Teddy Roosevelt. He calls all the coaches of the big football schools, and at that time, Harvard and Yale and Ivy League schools were big. He calls them to the White House, the coaches, and says, you have to change the rules to make the game safer because I don't want it to be banned. And so there are ultimately two possibilities. They can either make the field wider so that it sort of spreads out the players and it's easier to get around the corner, or they can make the passing game legal. It was illegal to throw a pass. And Teddy Roosevelt, so the story goes, this part I don't believe, thought, well, geez, if we make the field wider, it means we're going to have to rip down half of Soldiers Field, widen it, and then rebuild it. So he really pushes them, apparently, towards the passing game. So Harvard reinvents football, American football, and Teddy saves the day. And if you notice, very soon after this rule change, you have a big change in the football too. That is much more of a football you can probably throw. Okay, we're going to wrap up now. I want to talk about commencement. It may surprise you to know that graduates in the 17th and 18th centuries received their bachelor's degree at commencement. They were not, however, handed a diploma. As part of the ceremony, the president handed each graduate a book of arts, so basically a library book. But that book had to be handed back and was returned to the college library immediately after the ceremony. There was no physical proof that you had graduated from Harvard, because Harvard, for its first 2 centuries, was like a regional college. Its graduates existed in a social network made up of people who could easily confirm if the person in front of them was indeed a Harvard graduate. And barring that, they could consult the triennial catalog. This was a complete list of Harvard graduates printed every 3 years, starting in 1676. Having completed the requirements for the degree was only one prerequisite for graduating and being listed in the catalog, though. You had to pay, the other one was you had to pay £3. That was the commencement fee. £3 was a hefty sum in those days. That was almost a full year's tuition. But the college was so desperate for revenue that charging for completion was the only way to get it. One huge difference between commencement today and the commencements at Harvard in the 17th and 18th centuries, and even in the early 19th century, was that it was a huge party, like a county fair. And I'm not talking about in the yard, I'm talking about over on the Cambridge Common. The mirth making on the Cambridge Common during commencement was often described over the centuries. It was like a big county fair, like you see here. And not just the people that had anything to do with the college. It was a big holiday in Eastern Massachusetts. So we have this satirical description of commencement. This is first printed in 1718, provides a colorful description of the scene that developed just outside the yard on the Common. Early on the July morning of commencement was in July, as if, quote, drawn by some magnetic virtue, people would start to arrive in Cambridge in vast numbers. They're not just eager parents or solemn ministers, but rather, quote, all sizes and each sex, the ways do throng, both black and white, ride jig by jol along. Arriving in Cambridge, some of them went right to the taverns, while others went to the Common, where they could roll balls at 9-pins, this is like an early version of bowling, play cards, or wrestle in rings drawn in the dirt. In this description, there's no actual mention of the commencement ceremony, but the author's disdain for the drinking that happened here and for the fornication is clear. Here's another quote. While some intoxicated are with wine, others as brutish propagate their kind. After what I imagine was a really fun day of singing and dancing and drinking, some of these commencement revelers can, quote, scarce blunder home by break of day. Some lie in open fields, others there are who to their homes half boozy do repair. According to another description of commencement, the Common had, quote, gamblers gathered around a wheel of fortune, jolly hucksters displaying their tempting wares in the shape of cooling beverages and palate-tickling confections, a pantomimic show, a blind man led by a dog soliciting alms, organ grinders, hurdy-gurdy grinders, jugglers, sword swallowers, all mingled in inextricable confusion. Humans were joined on the Common by monkeys, bears, less common wild animals, and in 1797, an elephant named Old Bet. The broadside that advertised the pachyderm's appearance at commencement stated that the fee to see her was 25 cents for adults and $0.125 of a dollar for children. It was lucky that this was still 2 decades before every graduate received a paper diploma at commencement as, quote, the elephant having destroyed many papers of consequence. It is recommended to visitors not to come near him with such papers. Some of you on this call have graduated from Harvard, and you probably recognize this figure. Well, maybe not this sheriff of Middlesex. A sheriff of Middlesex was at your ceremony, your graduation ceremony, and was in some ways the master of ceremonies. He opens and closes the commencement, and he usually now is sort of goofy and bangs this big pole on the ground, whatever. Where does this come from? In the 1730s, Harvard president Benjamin Wadsworth asked the lieutenant governor to direct the sheriff of Middlesex County to attend commencement with 20 constables and several justices of the peace to preserve order. Today, the sheriff of Middlesex's loud knocking of his staff is an amusing moment during commencement, but it's an echo of Harvard trying to control the riffraff frolicking out on the common in the 18th century. 2020 was not the first time commencement was canceled. On June 26, 1771, that's several weeks before the day that would normally have been commencement day, the following notice appeared in the Boston Newsletter. This is, again, 1721. Notice is hereby given to all persons concerned that by reason of any danger that may arise from the smallpox's spreading, the commencement at Cambridge this year will be managed privately and not on the usual day, the first Wednesday of July. In addition to the cancellation of the festivities outside of the yard, this commencement had no meal in the commons for the guests, nor was any post-ceremony socializing allowed. It would not be the last time the commencement was either drastically curtailed or canceled. In 1740, with diphtheria spreading in New England, students were again sent home early, but commencement was ultimately held in August after the disease had abated. In 1752, again, because of smallpox, students were all sent home in May, months before commencement. Those who had completed their coursework were awarded the degree, quote, without their personal attendance, which is this degree right here. In 1757, in the midst of the 7 Years' War, the overseers again decided to cancel an in-person commencement. 1764, we already talked about, was really a dark year for Harvard. Harvard Hall had burned to the ground in January. And since its construction in 1686, this had been the site of the commencement meal, where all of the graduates and the alumni who had come gathered for a meal. Given this loss, as well as the threat of smallpox, again, the administration canceled the ceremony and awarded all of the candidates their degrees without their personal attendance. The Revolutionary War also interrupted the tradition of commencement. For every year between 1774 and 1780, no commencement was held in Cambridge. The college simply printed a general diploma like this one, which listed all the names of the graduates, as well as adding them to the triennial catalog. I've come to a close. This is all my time, but I still have lots of other stories to tell. And hopefully these ones you can either hear another time, or you can read about when the book eventually comes out. I have about 85% of the text written. I just need to get back in the archives for about a month. I can finish it up. But yeah, I'll throw my email up on the screen here, and I am super happy to take any questions, any and all questions you have. And I think I might let maybe Jill, you want to moderate that?
I am happy to.
Okay,
yeah. Oh my God. Let me just say, I wish you could hear the laughter going on, because my gosh, so many of these facts are so interesting and new and absurd at times, you know, just so fascinating. But we've had a number of questions sort of popping on in chat. Feel free, everybody, if you want to use the Q&A box, go ahead. But let me just get started. We'll start kind of at the back, you know, the beginning of your presentation. That water pump that we have all walked by so many times, did that freeze over in the winter? Like, how did that work?
Apparently it was deep enough that it didn't freeze, because there are reports of students having pumped in the middle of the winter, but we look at that today and we're like, oh, that's so quaint, old Harvard, you know, OLDE Harvard. No student graduate from the 1800s would have looked at that pump fondly. Definitely not. In fact, the pump was blown up a number of times. So it elicits a very different feeling from us today. And I think in the alumni magazine, one of the columns is called "The Old Pump" or something like that.
That's fabulous. Now there was a question when I think you mentioned, was it Roosevelt? Any information on something called a butter rebellion? Does that ring a bell?
There's the Butter Rebellion, which I think the Stinking Butter Rebellion is like 1762. That's Thoreau's grandfather. There's the Rotten Cabbage Rebellion. There's the Great Rebellion. Most of these rebellions are about crappy food, at least superficially, but that they all have deeper causes. And part of that is just this incredibly boring, irrelevant curriculum, I think.
Yes. No, that's
and they're like 14 years old. I mean, a bunch of 14-year-olds in a dining hall, like what's going to happen there? Come on.
Yeah, that's just so interesting. And the things they had in their rooms, like, my God, it makes more sense when you think about ages, you know. But let's see, how did the American Revolution and independence change Harvard?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a $10 question right there.
There is.
Briefly, first, Harvard decamps to Concord for a full year. Harvard just like pulls up stakes and moves to Concord because they're worried about fights breaking out between students and British soldiers. And so, oh, Gore Hall. Oh, I want to talk about that one, Veronica. So they go to Concord for a year, and basically the students hate it because they're really, really, really far away from the city, and the rooms are really drafty, and they're all sort of improvised rooms. So like the buddy you were rooming with in Hollis Hall, now he's like a mile down the street in, you know, some old farmer's house. And it also changes after the war. The idea of what education is for changes a little bit, and it starts to be education to mold citizens. So not just to like create an elite, but there's this idea of like, we need to make citizens who are loyal to the new country. That's part of it.
That's great. Now, do you want to say something about Gore Hall?
Yeah. So Gore Hall, I have a great anecdote about Gore Hall. And I can't, but yeah, Veronica said it's still, Gore Hall is Harvard's first real freestanding library. The library had been in Harvard Hall for a long time, but then Gore Hall's built in the mid 1800s, donated by the Gore family, go figure. And when the Titanic goes down and Harry Elkins Widener dies, his mother comes to Harvard and says, I want to build a library for my son. And they're delighted. The administration is psyched because Gore Hall is just stuffed with books, and it's this old Gothic structure. So they can't wait to rip down Gore Hall. And so they say to her, yeah, cool. We'll rip down Gore Hall and we'll build your library. And Mrs. Widener says, well, what about the Gore family? And Harvard says, oh, they're all dead. Don't worry about it. And so the story goes, this is not true, I just found the contract, but the story goes that Mrs. Widener, being no idiot, thinks, well, when all the Wideners are dead, they're just going to rip down my library and put up a new one in the same place and for somebody else. And so she, again, the story goes, she puts in a requirement that if Harvard ever changes the name or they ever change Widener Library, that the huge endowment that she leaves for the library and all of the old books that she donates, all Harry's old books, are going to go to Yale. So that's why Widener has not been touched. Again, not a true story, but such a good story. I love it. If you go to Harvard anytime soon, when you're looking at Widener, over on the right-hand corner on the front of the library is a plaque that shows Gore Hall. And if you look at that plaque, there's like these weird kind of steeples on the top of Gore Hall. Those structures, those stone steeple things on the top, the caps of the towers, two of them are around the back of Widener, on right next to the entrance. You'll see them when you go to Widener, you'll know. But look at the plaque on the front of Widener, look at the building Gore Hall, and then go around the back and find the structures there. So they did save those two.
Yeah. That's so cool. Okay, I'm definitely checking that out the minute I can get back in that building. So here's a good question. Julie asks, can you say more about how Radcliffe saved Harvard?
Radcliffe saves Harvard's butt, big time.
Yeah.
In the 1940s, so the United States declares war on the Axis, December 8th, 1941. And Harvard students who always had volunteered in droves for American wars volunteer. And so Harvard all of a sudden has this huge campus and lots of professors and not many students. And so Harvard has always treated Radcliffe to that point pretty badly. In fact, Charles Eliot, the president, who I otherwise really like, once said, they asked him about coeducation, and he said, well, Radcliffe has only one thing, and Harvard doesn't want it, and that's female students. turns out Harvard did want it in 1942. So in 1942, Harvard starts what they will not call coeducation. They call it coordinated education. So basically, instead of Harvard professors, after their Harvard lectures, going over to Radcliffe and teaching the same class, which they'd always done, now Radcliffe students are in the same classrooms as Harvard students, and they all hear the same lecture. Oh, I'd love to talk about the Cuban flag. Yes, let me jump back to that. So, this basically saves Harvard, and Radcliffe starts to give Harvard a bunch of the tuition money. This starts this long march towards the merger non-merger, because it's not really a merger, right? We don't have a school called Harvard Cliff. There's just Harvard. Radcliffe just disappears. But yeah, the Radcliffe students giving a bunch of tuition money and filling these classrooms in the 1940s saves Harvard. It really does. There are other ways that Radcliffe has contributed, and I would love to tell the observatory story if people are interested in that in a minute. It's one of my favorites, but if you want to go on, Jill, or if you want to.
No, I think we should pause there. We've got the Cuban flag and the observatory, so take your pick.
Let's do both of those. So the Cuban flag, the United States in 1898 starts what is commonly called the Spanish-American War, but it's basically 6 weeks of war with Spain, and then the rest of it is like a pretty brutal war against the Philippines, against Filipino, what are called insurgents, but are basically Filipino nationalists saying, yeah, we actually don't want to trade one colonial master for another. But the United States takes over Cuba and Puerto Rico, and the general who leads the invasion is a Harvard graduate. And then the guy who gets put in charge of public education in Cuba in 1899 is also a Harvard graduate. And he comes up with this idea. He wants to bring half of Cuba's public school teachers to Harvard in the summer of 1900 and do a summer school. And it's amazing. So he writes this long telegraph to Eliot and says, I want to do this. What do you think? And Eliot responds with one word. He says, yes. So there's a huge subscription thing where people from Boston, rich people, but also people of limited means, contribute to this fund. They bring something like 1,100 Cuban public school teachers on military transports from Cuba to Boston. And the men are in Harvard dorms and the women are in private houses all around Cambridge and Boston. And these Cuban teachers are like rock stars. Like everybody wants to have the Cubans over to their house for dinner. One part of this I really like, I mean, there's like these weird imperial parts because they're teaching them like the history of Spanish rule in Cuba. So like Spain's the boogeyman. And then the history of like enlightened American imperial rule. We're going to be so nice and let you do whatever you want, unless it goes against our interests, then not so much. So there's like an imperial aspect of this I find pretty nefarious. But I like the fundraising part that even working class Bostonians wanted to bring the Cuban teachers. Also, they asked a bunch of Harvard students, hey, when we bring up these Cuban teachers, can they use your dorm room? Because then you had your dorm room year round. Can they use your dorm room? Can they sleep in your bed? And can they use your linens? And most Harvard students said yes to all three. This is an openness to Latin America and also to people, remember, from Cuba, African descended people that we don't see again at Harvard for a long time. So it's really cool that this happens. And also, all of the Cubans had a little pin on their shirt, a little red pin with a number. Every single one had a different number. And if everybody in Boston and Cambridge knew, if you saw somebody that had one of these pins and they looked like they were confused, you were supposed to go and help them get back to like the trolley or the train or whatever. So I love that story. The observatory one is also awesome. If I have time to tell that too.
Yeah, of course. Go for it.
Oh, it's great. So in 1839, I think his name is Louis Daguerre, invents photography, invents the daguerreotype. And pretty quickly, this gets put to scientific use. And Harvard in the 1830s they decided to start an observatory. And they build a building that is still at the core of the observatory, out on a hill. It's like a quarter mile from Harvard Square, now right next to the Radcliffe Yard. And in those days, there was nothing else out there. It was like literally a cow pasture. So they build it on top of the hill. And they're sort of tinkering around. I mean, astronomy has been part of the curriculum for a long time, but they're not doing a ton because they don't have any money. But then in 1876, Harvard put some money towards the observatory. They hired this new guy named Pickering. He's like the first guy. He created the first physics laboratory course in the world. They hire him and they say, look, we want to do big stuff here. So Pickering decides to do this massive project that he knows he'll never see the end of. They're going to take photographs of the entire night sky, glass plate photographs through telescopes, and they're going to give every single star an individual number, and they're going to make this huge reference work called the Henry Draper Memorial, this huge reference work with every single visible star, visible not to the naked eye, visible, photographable. They're going to name it or give it a number, and they're going to give information about its spectrum. They're going to shoot the light from each star through a prism and record its spectrum photographically, and they're going to assign it a value, a relative magnitude value. So they start this project, and at first they have a couple of guys do it, but the pay isn't great, and also guys are upwardly mobile, right? If you're like a smart college-educated guy in 1876, you can do other stuff. So finally, Pickering's wife, the director of the observatory's wife, says, why don't you hire the Scottish maid we have working for us? This woman named Williamina Fleming. She'd come to Boston from Scotland with her husband. She was pregnant. Her husband abandons her, but she luckily gets this job as sort of a janitor of the observatory / maid for the Pickerings. And she's smart. And so Pickering's wife says, hire her. She can do it. So Pickering does. And very quickly, he gets rid of the male computers. They're called computers. And he has Williamina doing all this work. Now, she's just doing data entry because women, of course, are too delicate to do photographs and observe stars through telescopes. This is the idea in the 1870s. So she's doing data entry. She's taken all of these, and Harvard still has 500,000 of these glass plates this big, all these tiny little dots, and she's got to assign a value to every single one, then go later back and look at the spectrum. So Williamina hires like 10 other women ultimately that are doing this work, and it's just data entry, right? Because it's a dead-end career. They can't move up. They can't move to some other job, so they can get paid dirt, but they're all smart and they do great work. And these women doing data entry start to notice patterns. So first of all, they come up with a brand new system of relative magnitudes and stars. And this is like the core of the modern system. It's called the Harvard system, and it's invented by these women. Second, they create this amazing reference work, the Draper Memorial, that is still like the reference work for astronomy. Third, one of these women, I think Williamina's not her predecessor, the woman who comes after her, Annie Jump Cannon, she notices certain stars are variable because they do multiple takes. They don't want to just have one take. And she notices certain stars have a variable magnitude and it's variable over time, but it's a very specific cycle. And I don't know the physics of this at all. I'm not an astronomer, but she figures out that you can tell how far away these stars are by the variability. And you can also tell other stars that are near it. It's like the foundation of modern astronomy. The last woman gets her PhD, not from Harvard, from Radcliffe, even though Radcliffe didn't grant PhDs, because God forbid a woman get a PhD from Harvard. And she has this, at the time, absolutely bizarre idea that stars are actually almost all gas. They're almost all hydrogen and helium. Everyone else, the whole scientific establishment says, no, they're like planets. They're just sort of on fire. And she says, no, I think they're all gas. And she's right. So the foundation of modern astronomy is created at Harvard, not by famous people, famous scientists or Harvard professors, but by women who are doing data entry, but ultimately do data analysis. And there are two great books. One of them is by Davis Sobel. I can't remember who the other one is, but there's two really good books on this too.
Wow. I mean, what a fascinating look at gender studies your whole talk has been, and just such an interesting window in that time and all that women have gone through. My goodness. Now, let's see. We'll just take a little bit of a step back. I loved and I thank you for showing so much fascinating history related to Harvard Extension School. I mean, that is just so neat to see. And we've been so proud of the technology innovations that we've made through the years, but to see the courses on the Navy ships and to see like imagery, it's just it's brilliant. And the commencement aspect too, how timely and relevant, because here we are going into our second round of rescheduled commencements. And, it's sad to not be able to see that sheriff this year and have to delay it for the future. But I guess the history books will be rewritten with our virtual graduations, right? It's all new. It's fascinating, but that's happening on May 27th. So we will welcome people back to the art eventually. Now, I had a question. You referenced excavations in the yard. How often do these happen? I know that there was a great display in the Museum of Natural History 2-3 years ago with the relics that were found in the latest yard excavation. But how often does that happen? And have you witnessed them?
So for the last 15 years, every other year in the fall, they do a class called the Archaeology of Harvard Yard. Oh, yep, there we go. Harvard Yard Archaeology Project. Cool. So that's a class, and they do digs. But there's also been some large scale stuff. And of course, every time, I think there was a subway expansion in the 80s, and they did a bunch of digging sort of prior to that. And anytime something's got to be, a new water main or whatever, you're going to turn something up. And so there's been a mix of coordinated, let's dig up the yard. There's been this class. And then there's also these sort of occasional things that they got to dig it up for some practical reason, and they find stuff. But there's a dissertation on this that just lists absolutely everything. There's a couple other good articles. There's what is it? The archaeology of the Ivy League. There's a book edited collection on it. But I just find it funny that when they do these digs, they find out that the students ignored all of the rules. Any rule you had in the rule books, the physical evidence completely contradicts it.
Yes. And, all of those relics, those tumblers and pipes and everything they find in the yard, it's just amazing. And,
more glass bottles, more glass bottles than a colonial tavern. That's a lot of drinking.
That's so great. Lori asked, do you have a favorite story? Is there something that you just love? It's also interesting, but I wonder if there's anything that, is priceless to you.
I mean, if I have to tell 3 stories, the Cuban summer school and the women at the observatory are probably going to be 2 of the stories. There's another good story is about the best professor at Harvard in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but he didn't teach at Harvard. His name was the Widow Nolan, and he taught across the street in Manter Hall. So if you go on Massachusetts Avenue and you go to Clover, the cafe, it was above there. That was the first one. And then back down the other end of Holyoke Street, I think there's a Bank of America walk-in ATM. That was the other location. William Nolan graduated from Harvard, and he spent 2 years working in a lab, but then he started tutoring, and he would tutor students who weren't good at their classes on how to pass. And he was really good at it. And so he created this whole cottage industry, sort of and he had Cliff Notes books, the Cliff Note type books. But you would pay right before your exam, you'd pay for a 6-hour session with him or one of his assistants. And it was like an empire. And Harvard hated this guy, because they saw him as undermining the academic standards but if you look at the accounts of Widow Nolan, he used all of the elements of what now we'd say is really good pedagogy. So he had bullet points. He had students constantly writing short essays, so they were forced to recall stuff. He had all sorts of really cool mnemonic devices. He used a lot of emotion. He would bang on the walls. He was talking about a thunderclaps or whatever. So he was probably the best professor at Harvard between 1895 and 1920, but he didn't teach at Harvard.
Wow, that's neat. Who knew, right? My gosh. Well, there's questions about your book, and you mentioned that you're going back in to do research. Do you have a goal of when you think you'll finish that?
I mean, I could probably finish the manuscript if I had a month in the archives and another 6 months to go back and do rewriting. And my agent feels confident that we can sell the book. So but I would say you're not going to see it in bookstores for another year, at least.
Okay.
Probably.
And in the meantime, can you talk about what you teach?
Sure. I taught the biggest class in the history department this semester, which was fun. And it was called History 1636, the course number, obviously not random. Intro to Harvard History, Beyond the Three Lies. Actually, I could talk about the three lies too in a minute. If you want to loop back.
Yeah, please go ahead.
And the course came about not because I had any deep interest in Harvard history. You can tell from my dissertation that, I think about train stations and food. But a couple of years ago, I wanted to teach a methods class. I wanted to teach a class about historical methods because I saw my students just didn't have good methodology. And so I was like, I need to have like a vehicle for this. Because if a class called Historical Methods 101, like nobody's taking that class. I wouldn't take that class, Jill, and I'm a historian. Right? It sounds like death warmed over. And so I thought maybe I could make it like a Boston history class. So I asked one of my friends, do you think if I made this a Boston history class and did a field trip or two, it could be popular? And she said, oh, you should teach it on Harvard history. And this is 3 years ago. And I said, I don't know anything about Harvard history. And she said, neither did the undergraduates. I mean, just do some reading over the summer and figure it out. So my class initially was just, Harvard history was like the excuse. It was just to get people in the door. And then by week 5, when they figured out, wait, this is actually a methods class. Too late, you can't drop it. But the two books about Harvard history are so mediocre that I just thought, I'm going to write my own. And now, having done the research, I think I'm one of like the foremost historians of Harvard history, only because there's like 5 of us, and I think one of them is an undergraduate. So it's become something so really interesting to me in and of itself. And just because Harvard, for better, for worse, has been the first, or if not the first, the most important in a lot of things. So I went to Kenyon College. I could never teach a class about US history or historical methods teaching about the history of Kenyon College, but Harvard is pretty easy to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Amazing. And of course, there's the question, could you ever teach that in extension? I'm sure, we would love that, but if you ever have the thought.
I can't reveal negotiations that are ongoing, but let's just say that that's a possibility for the fall.
That's great. Oh, well, I know that would be extremely well attended. It's fascinating. Really, you'll probably get enrollees from this session.
I hope so.
Yes. My gosh. Well, thank you so much. I know the questions will keep pouring in, but we will let you go. You've been so generous with your time and really just wonderful storytelling ability. I wish you could hear the feedback from the audience. This Zoom format is not that friendly in terms of that, but my God, it was great and so interesting. I want to, before we wrap up, if you have any last words you'd like to say, by all means, the floor is yours.
I just appreciate the opportunity. I've been far away from my students for a long time, and it's also really nice to have however many people on this call who are really just interested to hear the history. So thank you all so much for it. And thank you to the clubs for organizing this, and Extension alums of Texas, and also to the office, your office, Jill, and all your colleagues. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the time. I'd love to come back some other time and do some trivia.
We would love that. Or if you want to come back and talk about food policy, sustainability, any of your passions otherwise are fascinating. And
happy to do. I have a great thing on truffles if you want to hear the
oh my goodness. Yeah. That's fun. And count me in on that one. But really, thank you so much for all of your time and thoughtfulness in this presentation. And it is recorded and it will be captioned fully and posted on Harvard Extension School's YouTube channel. And thank you again. I will echo those thanks to our wonderful volunteers in Texas from the HEAA Texas chapter and the Harvard Clubs of Austin and Dallas. If you are in Texas, in the area, you will find no more welcoming of clubs than these wonderful people and leaders. And I encourage you to get involved in whatever way that you possibly can. Otherwise, please join us again for another virtual presentation, and we will have plenty more faculty stars like Professor Nowak in the future. So come on back. And in the meantime, be well. But thank you. Good night.
Thanks, everybody.
We adore you. Bye, everybody.